There are many elements of instruction, and it's hard to undoubtedly say which ones are the best because it's very subjective. It all depends on the person teaching the lesson, the audience the lesson is being taught to, and the topics that the lesson is covering. It's all very subjective based on those. So in this video, I'm going to give you my favorite elements of instruction, and I'm going to give you examples of how I work these elements into a lesson plan that I recently wrote about genetics. So I always think it's a good idea to start off your lesson with an attention grabber like I did here. It's just a good way to get your students more engaged and just wake them up a little bit and get them open their minds. And it also lets you gauge what they already know coming into your lesson. So in this lesson right here that I made about genetics, I opened it up with a question, just simply asking what makes you, you. It's just a very open-ended question. It gets your students thinking, gets them talking, and you can just gauge what they know about genetics. And then I think it's a good idea just to lay out the objectives for the day, just to let your students know what is expected of them by the end of the lesson. I think it's good. As a student, I always feel like I paid more attention in class when I knew exactly what I was getting into. And I wrote my objectives. I actually put them in the PowerPoint that I made for this lesson. And then after the objectives are laid out, I think it's a good idea to just jump in some vocab. Just let your students know about some key phrases and words that they need to know in order to better follow your lesson. I think it's good to lay it out like this, that way you don't have to stop in the middle of a lecture or whatever activity that you're doing that day, and just to explain what a specific word or phrase means. So I created its own slide in my PowerPoint titled vocab, and I have the vocabulary words and their definitions labeled right here. That would be on the slide. And then just a group activity. I think that's good just because it'll wake the kids up even more. It'll get them more engaged. It's more of a hands-on learning experience. It'll wake them up. I think it'll help them pay more attention in class too, make them more open to learning. So, for example, here my group activity is survey the class to see who possesses common traits that are passed down through genetics. And I would describe each trait, and I would get them to raise their hands if they have it, and all that stuff. And this really ties into my lesson because it shows the kids firsthand how much genetics impact us. It may fascinate them, which will make them more interested in the lesson. And then I go into the lecture, just the instruction. That's pretty straightforward. But then after the lecture, I would set up an individual activity, and that's just to gauge how the student did in the lecture. See if they got anything out of it. For example, my individual activity here is to get the students to make their own Punnett square based on their parents' eye color, and then for them to interpret their Punnett square to see what are the percentages that they were born with the eye color that they were born with. And then it's always important just to ask your students if they have any questions. You have to make sure that they really followed you in the lesson. They're not iffy on anything. Especially in science classes like this, where a lot of previous material new material builds on to previous material, so you need to have a good foundation. So you have to make sure your students are okay on what you went over. And then I think a little exit slip assessment, just to make sure your students really followed you with the lesson. So my exit slip assessment, I'm just asking them the objectives. I'm asking them to perform what was expected of them that I told them was expected of them at the beginning of the class. And that is it.